Let me start with a simple question that most people never really stop to ask. Why does Latin America matter so much to Washington? Not rhetorically, not emotionally, strategically. Because if you look at how the United States behaves around the world, the intensity is not evenly distributed. Some regions get speeches, some get sanctions, some get wars. And Latin America has always received something different, pressure that never fully goes away. Here's the thing most headlines miss. This isn't about ideology, it's not about democracy, and it's definitely not about humanitarian concern. It's about proximity, leverage, and control. Latin America is not just a neighboring region to the United States. It is the only part of the world where Washington has historically expected automatic compliance. Not alignment, compliance. That expectation is now breaking down. And that's why you're seeing anxiety, not confidence, in U.S. policy. Before we go further, a quick note. As this new year begins, I want to wish you and your family health, stability, and clarity in a world that's becoming more uncertain by the day. Thank you for spending your time here. Now, let's get into what's really happening. For most of the 20th century, the Western Hemisphere operated under a quiet assumption. What happened in Latin America would never be allowed to seriously challenge U.S. interests. When it did, it was corrected. Sometimes softly, sometimes violently, but always decisively. That wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. Control over Latin America meant secure shipping lanes, predictable governments, stable energy access, and no hostile great power operating close to U.S. territory. That last point matters more than people realize. The United States can tolerate rivals thousands of miles away. It has never tolerated rivals in its immediate neighborhood. The Cold War made that painfully clear. But something has changed over the past 15 years, and it didn't happen all at once. Latin America started diversifying, not ideologically, economically. China arrived not with troops, but with contracts, ports, railways, energy infrastructure, long-term commodity deals. No lectures, no regime change talk, just business. Russia followed, more selectively, offering security cooperation, energy partnerships, and diplomatic backing for governments that felt permanently cornered by Washington. And suddenly, the old leverage stopped working the way it used to. Sanctions didn't isolate the way they once did. Diplomatic pressure didn't scare leaders the way it used to. Even financial threats lost some of their bite. That's when Washington's tone began to change. You can hear it if you listen carefully. Less confidence, more urgency, more framing of the region as a battleground again. Because here's the uncomfortable truth for U.S. strategists. If Latin America stops being politically predictable, the United States doesn't just lose influence, it loses strategic depth. Energy is a big part of that. Venezuela is the obvious example, but it's not the only one. Brazil, Mexico, Guyana, Argentina, and offshore Caribbean reserves all matter, not just for oil, but for control over supply chains that feed global industry, global shipping, and increasingly global data infrastructure. Energy today is not just about fuel. It underwrites logistics, military readiness, and economic resilience. If you lose influence over energy producers near your borders, you're forced to compete for it farther away at higher cost with less control. That's a dangerous position for any great power. Now add migration into the equation. Millions of people moving north are not just a humanitarian issue, they are a political pressure valve.
Migration into
when
the
economies
equation.
in Latin America collapse, instability doesn't stay local. It moves. It shows up at borders. It reshapes elections. It fractures domestic consensus inside the United States itself. So when Washington looks south, it doesn't see individual countries making sovereign choices. It sees risk clustering, risk to energy security, risk to political stability, risk to strategic dominance. And the fear underneath all of it is simple. If Latin America slips fully into a multipolar orbit, where China trades, Russia secures, and local governments hedge instead of aligning, then the Monroe Doctrine, whether anyone admits it or not, is functionally dead. That would be a historic
and local governments
loss.
hedge
Not
instead
because
of
the
align.
doctrine was moral,
Then the
but
Monroe
because
Doctrine,
it worked.
whether anyone
And when
admits it or
systems
not,
that have
is
worked for over a
functionally
century
dead.
start to
That
fail,
would be a historic
great powers
loss.
don't calmly
Not
adapt.
because the
They
doctrine
react,
was moral, but
sometimes by
because it
tightening
worked.
economic
And when
screws,
systems that
sometimes
have
by
worked for
backing
over a
friendly
century
elites,
start to fail,
sometimes by
great powers
destabilizing
don't calmly
alternatives
adapt.
before they
They
fully
react,
mature.
sometimes by
This is the
tightening
context you have
economic
to keep in
screws,
mind when you hear
sometimes
talk
by
about
backing
sanctions,
friendly elites,
democracy promotion,
sometimes by
or regional
destabilizing
security
alternatives
partnerships.
before they fully mature.
Those are not causes,
This
they are
is the
tools.
context you have to
Now,
keep in
we
mind
need to
when you
look
hear
at
talk
how
about
Washington
sanctions,
actually applies
democracy
those
promotion,
tools,
or
why the old
regional
playbook is
security
failing,
partnerships.
and why the
Those
pressure
are
on
not
Latin America
causes,
is likely
they
to
are tools.
intensify rather
And
than
in the next
fade.
part, we need to look at
Because
how
slipping
Washington
away doesn't
actually
happen
applies
overnight.
those tools,
It
why
happens
the
when
old
control
playbook is
quietly
failing,
turns into
and
competition.
why the pressure on
To
Latin
understand
America
why
is likely to
Washington is feeling
intensify
cornered in
rather than
Latin
fade.
America,
Because
you have to
slipping
look at
away
the
doesn't
tools it
happen
has relied
overnight.
on for
It
decades,
happens when control
and then
quietly
ask an
turns into
uncomfortable
competition.
question.
2.
What
Understand
happens
why
when
Washington
those
is feeling
tools
cornered
stop
in Latin
working?
America.
For most of the post-Cold War era, U.S. influence rested on a simple
What
equation.
happens when those tools stop
Access
working?
to the dollar system,
For most of the post-Cold War
access to
era,
Western
U.S.
markets,
influence rested on a
access
simple
to global
equation.
finance, all in exchange for political alignment. Countries didn't need to love Washington. They just needed to stay within the system. Sanctions were the enforcement mechanism. They worked not because
Sanctions
they
were the
immediately
enforcement
changed
mechanism.
behavior, but
They worked
because
not because they
slowly
immediately changed
suffocated
behavior,
options.
but because they
If you
slowly
couldn't trade
suffocated
freely,
options.
couldn't
You
borrow
couldn't trade
cheaply,
freely,
couldn't
couldn't borrow
insure
cheaply,
shipments or settle
and couldn't insure
transactions,
shipments or settle transactions,
then time worked against you. Governments
eventually
folded,
folded.
or they were
Or they were
replaced.
replaced.
That model depended on one assumption. There was no real alternative system. That assumption
is no longer true.
China didn't set out to challenge sanctions directly. It did something more effective. It built parallel pathways. Long-term supply contracts settled in non-dollar currencies. State-backed financing that ignored Western risk assessments.
Infrastructure projects that locked in decades of dependency without IMF oversight.
None of this required ideological alignment. It required patience. Russia, operating under sanctions itself, learned how to survive outside Western systems. It shared
Through energy
those
swaps,
lessons,
shipping
not
workarounds,
openly,
and diplomatic
quietly.
shielding.
Through energy swaps, shipping workarounds, and diplomatic shielding. So when Washington applies pressure today, the results are different. Sanctions still hurt. No one seriously denies that.
They
But
reorganize
they no
behavior.
longer isolate.
Cuts.
They reorganize
They reroute.
behavior. Countries don't collapse. They reroute. And Latin America has become very good at
When
rerouting.
Venezuela was pushed out of
Take
traditional
energy
markets,
again.
oil didn't
when
disappear.
Venezuela was
It
pushed
moved
out
through
of traditional
intermediaries.
markets,
Through
oil
blending.
didn't disappear.
Through shadow
It moved
shipping.
through intermediaries.
Through buyers willing
blending,
to accept
through
political
shadow
risk in
shipping,
exchange for discounted
through
supply.
buyers willing to
The same
accept
pattern appears
political
in
risk
mining,
in exchange
agriculture,
for
and
discounted
manufacturing.
supply. The same pattern appears in mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. What Washington sees as enforcement, others experience as adaptation. And adaptation breeds confidence. Once a government survives sanctions without immediate collapse, the psychological barrier breaks. The fear that kept leaders cautious begins to
Because
fade.
when pressure no longer guarantees
Compliance
obedience,
turns into
great powers
negotiation.
escalate.
Negotiation
Not always
turns into
militarily.
resistance. This is where things get dangerous, because when pressure no longer guarantees obedience, great powers escalate. Not always militarily, often economically, politically, informationally. You see it in narrative framing. Suddenly, internal failures are externalized. Corruption is emphasized selectively. Elections are scrutinized unevenly. Economic crises are framed as moral
Latin America
failures
today
rather
is
than
not being pressured to
structural
behave well.
outcomes of isolation. This isn't new, but the intensity is. Latin America today is not being pressured to behave well. It is being pressured to choose sides. And Washington is discovering that many governments prefer ambiguity.
From
They
a
want
local
US
perspective,
market
this
access
is rational
without US
hedging.
obedience. They want Chinese investment without Chinese control.
Now add
They
domestic
want
US
Russian
politics to the
security ties
equation.
without
The
Russian
United States
dependence.
is no longer
From a
operating with a
local
unified
perspective,
foreign policy
this is
consensus,
rational
trade,
hedging.
immigration,
From
energy,
Washington's
and national
perspective,
security,
looks like
and now deeply
disloyalty.
entangled with internal
Now
political
add
survival.
domestic US politics
Every
to
crisis
the
abroad
equation.
echoes at home.
The United States is no longer operating with a unified foreign policy consensus.
When energy prices
Trade,
fluctuate, it
immigration,
becomes a domestic
energy, and
legitimacy
national
issue.
security are now deeply entangled with internal political survival. Every crisis abroad echoes at home. When instability in Latin America increases migration, it becomes an election issue. When
This is why
energy
you see
prices
contradictory
fluctuate,
behavior.
It becomes a domestic
engagement in one
legitimacy
moment,
issue. When
punishment
China
the
gains
next.
infrastructure footholds
Diplomatic
near US
outreach
trade
followed by
routes,
sudden
it becomes
sanctions.
a national
Cooperation
security
offered
talking
publicly,
point.
while pressure is
So
applied
foreign
privately.
policy becomes
To outside
reactive.
observers, it
Shorter
looks
time
incoherent.
horizons, harder
Internally,
edges,
it reflects anxiety.
less patience for
Because
nuance.
the United States is trying to
This is
preserve
why
a
you
regional
see
order that no
contradictory
longer
behavior.
rests on uncontested
Engagement
dominance.
in one moment,
And that creates a
punishment
dilemma, a
next.
pause.
Diplomatic
Washington pulls
outreach
back,
followed by
influence
sudden
erodes faster.
sanctions.
If Washington
Cooperation is
pushes
offered
harder,
publicly,
resistance
while
stiffens.
pressure is
There
applied
is no clean
privately.
option.
To outside observers,
What makes Latin
it looks
America
incoherent.
particularly sensitive is that it is
Internally,
not just
it
another
reflects
theater.
anxiety.
It is
Because the
geographically
United
close,
States is
economically
trying to
intertwined,
preserve a
and
regional
politically
order
visible
that
to
no
US
longer
voters.
rests on
Failures there
uncontested
are harder to
dominance.
ignore. Sir,
And that
the
creates a
instinct is to
dilemma.
manage
If
outcomes rather than
Washington
accept
pulls
them.
back,
But management
influence
requires
erodes
leverage.
faster.
And
If
leverage
Washington
requires
pushes
dependence.
harder,
That
resistance
dependence is
stiffens.
weakening.
There is no clean
Not
option.
collapsing.
What
Not
makes Latin
disappearing.
America particularly
but thinning.
sensitive
And when
is that
influence
it is
thins,
not just
pressure
another
increases.
theater. It is
In the next
geographically
part, we need to
close,
talk about the real
economically
strategic fear
intertwined,
underneath all
and
of this.
politically visible
Not
to US
sanctions,
voters.
not migration,
Failures are harder to ignore.
not even energy alone.
So the instinct
Duh.
is to
The
manage
fear that if
outcomes
Latin
rather
America
than accept
normalizes
them.
multipolar behavior,
But
the
management
United States
requires
loses
leverage,
something far more
and
important
leverage
than
requires
influence.
dependence.
It loses
That dependence
inevitability.
is weakening,
And once
not
inevitability is
collapsing,
gone,
not disappearing,
everything becomes a
but thinning.
negotiation.
And when influence thins, pressure increases. Now we need to talk about the real strategic fear underneath all of this. Not sanctions, not migration, not even energy alone. The fear that if Latin America normalizes multipolar behavior, the United States loses something far more important than influence. It loses inevitability. And once inevitability is gone, everything becomes a negotiation. To understand why the United States cannot afford to let Latin America drift away, you have to stop looking at the region as a collection of unstable governments and start looking at it as a strategic system that connects energy, food, migration, finance, and influence in ways that are becoming more decisive every year. For most of the post-Cold War period, Washington treated Latin America as politically important but strategically secondary. The assumption was that geography alone guaranteed alignment. The United States did not need to compete hard in its own hemisphere because there was nowhere else for these countries to go. That assumption is no longer true, and the consequences of realizing that too late are already visible. China did not enter Latin America with ideology. It entered with contracts, credit, ports, railways, and long-term commodity agreements. Beijing did not ask governments to reform their political systems. It asked whether they could deliver oil, copper, lithium, soy, iron ore, or access to logistics corridors. For countries that had spent decades being lectured about governance while struggling to finance development, that offer was not just attractive, it was transformative. What matters here is not whether Chinese involvement is good or bad for Latin America in moral terms. What matters is that it has structurally reduced U.S. leverage. When Washington applies pressure through sanctions, financial restrictions, or diplomatic isolation, it is no longer acting in a vacuum. Governments now calculate alternatives. They ask who will buy their exports, who will finance their infrastructure, and who will shield them diplomatically when relations with Washington deteriorate. This is where the U.S. strategy begins to show strain. Sanctions, once a precise instrument, are increasingly blunt. They signal displeasure, but they also accelerate diversification away from the U.S.-led system. Venezuela is the clearest example, but it is not unique. Nicaragua, Bolivia, parts of the Caribbean, and even traditional partners are quietly adjusting their exposure, not because they want confrontation, but because dependence has become risky. At the same time, Latin America has become central to the next phase of global competition in ways that were not true 20 years ago. Energy transitions require minerals that are geographically concentrated. Food security depends on stable exporters. Migration flows shape domestic politics in the United States more than any foreign conflict. Drug routes intersect with state capacity and regional security. None of these issues can be managed effectively if the region is politically alienated. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that Washington's tools are misaligned with its objectives. The United States wants influence, predictability, and access, but many of its policies signal punishment, conditionality, and distance. That gap creates space for other actors to step in, not because they are benevolent, but because they are present. Russia's role, while smaller economically, reinforces this dynamic. Moscow does not need to dominate Latin America to matter. It only needs to complicate U.S. decision-making, provide limited military cooperation, and signal that alignment is not binary. Even symbolic presence can force Washington to expend attention and resources it would rather deploy elsewhere. The deeper issue, however, is psychological. Latin America has spent decades being told it is strategically important, while being treated as politically inconvenient. That contradiction breeds resentment, even among governments that are not hostile to the United States. When crises emerge, they remember who showed up consistently and who appeared only when leverage was at stake. This is why Washington's concern is not simply about losing markets or influence. It is about losing the ability to shape outcomes close to home while facing rising pressure abroad. A United States that cannot stabilize its own hemisphere finds it harder to project credibility globally. Allies notice, rivals exploit it, neutral states hedge against it. The question, then, is not whether the United States should re-engage with Latin America. It is whether it can do so without defaulting to the habits that pushed the region away in the first place. Engagement based solely on pressure reinforces the very dynamics Washington is trying to reverse. Engagement based on partnership requires patience, consistency, and a willingness to accept political diversity without interpreting it as hostility. What this moment reveals is that Latin America is no longer a background theater. It is an arena where global competition is becoming quieter, more transactional, and more consequential. The outcome will not be decided by speeches or summits, but by whether Washington can adapt its approach before strategic distance hardens into strategic loss. What makes this moment different is that none of these shifts are happening in isolation. Energy, migration, trade, and influence are folding into one another, and Latin America is sitting right at the center of that convergence. The choices made now will shape not just regional alignments, but how much strategic room the United States has in the decade ahead. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Is Washington prepared to rethink how it deals with its own hemisphere, or will it keep relying on pressure while others quietly build long-term influence? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Comment below. Where are you watching from, and how does this look from your part of the world? I will see you guys in next video.